Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. We're going to look at another FRQ for AP Human Geography, another Unit 1 dominating FRQ. There's some Unit 2 at the end here, but for the most part, it's Unit 1. Still trying to introduce AP Human Geography, the content, as well as FRQs and writing in an appropriate style for these FRQs and making sure you're hitting all the points necessary to earn those points. Now, the length of this FRQ is 7 parts, just like last week's, and your AP exam is going to have 3 FRQs with 7 parts. And one of those FRQs are going to have one stimulus, and that could be a map or a chart or some other graph, or some other kind of data that you're going to have to analyze, and it may help you answer the question. It's certainly going to be related to the topics of the question. So one of your questions, question 2, will have one stimulus, and that's kind of similar to this question we have this week. Question 3 will have 2 stimuli, so a little bit more data and information that you're going to have to analyze. So this is our stimulus this week. It's a map of Antarctica, technically 2 maps of Antarctica, but they're kind of combined. So we're going to count it as one stimulus. So it shows the population distribution of Antarctica. It's not showing the population density, but it's showing the distribution. This is a thematic map. We're looking at a proportional symbol map, a graduated symbol map, and the symbols represent population. So the bigger circles have a larger quantity of population, 1,000 people. Then the smaller circles have 100 or 10 people if they're very, very small. We can see different sizes of circles at different spots of the maps here to show where population is clustered and where population is dispersed. And that's going to be very necessary to know for these questions. So let's go through them. So part A, explain why the scale of the maps were selected to display the population data. So first things first, you're going to have to identify the scale. And that's not necessary technically to answer this question, but it's very, very important. It's actually necessary to know. So scale, if you remember, is what is our data limited to? Essentially, what is the map showing? We are looking at a map of Antarctica, which is a continent. So our scale is continental. So how are we going to use that to answer this question? So the question is essentially asking, why did they choose a continental scale? And it's a very obvious answer because they want to show population distribution of Antarctica, the continent of Antarctica, the landmass of Antarctica. So you could say that the scale was used to show population distribution across the entire continent of Antarctica. And that's a pretty good answer. That's the right answer. Now, something that a lot of students may do is say population density. And that's because they just don't know the difference, or that there is a difference between population density and population distribution. Population distribution deals with spatial patterns and spatial analysis, where populations are spread out, where they're dispersed, or whether they're accumulated or close together. They're clustered. That's distribution. Density looks at a particular place and looks at how many people are in that place per unit of land. So when you hear 1,000 people per square mile, that's population density. Explain one advantage of using a map of higher scale to display population data within Antarctica. So what's an example of a map higher scale than a continental scale? So that could be a national scale, that could be a local scale, a subnational scale, something smaller than a continent. Now you may think higher scale means more land, like the world. A world map could be higher scale. That's going to be a smaller scale. And the reason for that is because we're going to get smaller amounts of detail per individual place. So we're not going to get as much population data about Antarctica, not as specific population data about Antarctica if we're looking at a world map. So to compensate for the higher amounts of land, we have less specific data. So a high scale map is actually going to be more specific data, and it's going to show a more local area. So we're going to see more detailed and more localized information. And example for this question, you could look at specific research stations, temporary settlements, and just areas of human activity. We could look at population patterns in specific regions of the continent. So we could look at central Antarctica. We don't see a lot of population there. Maybe we could see where in central Antarctica there is population. More specifically, or where on King George Island there's population, and where in McMurdo is there population. There's a lot of people in King George Island. There's a lot of people in McMurdo. Where specifically are they living in these places? Are they living on the coast? Are they living more mainland? So that gives us more detailed and more localized information. So any of these three responses or something, written along those lines would be fine as an appropriate answer. You don't need all three of them, but at least one of them. So you could just say where clusters of population are located in different regions, or where dispersals of population are located in different regions. Regions is the key word there if you're doing something similar to bullet point C. Let's look at now part C. Explain one reason for why geographers would utilize thematic maps over reference maps. So this one's essentially having you compare the application of thematic and reference maps. So what's different between them? Thematic maps, for the most part, display quantitative data. Quantitative data deals with numbers. You've learned that before. Qualitative data deals with qualities, and essentially that's just non-numerical data, which doesn't deal with numbers. A lot of times when we look at reference maps, we're looking at political boundaries and we're looking at land masses and other physical geography. That's all qualitative data. But for the example of this map, we're looking at quantitative data. We're looking at the actual population size, the numbers, which are quantities. We could use a thematic map to highlight specific data like the climate, rather than geographic features. We could analyze spatial patterns as well. So in this case, we're looking at a spatial pattern. We're looking at population distribution. Part D, describe a cluster and dispersal of population in Antarctica during summer. So first things first, you have to look at the map on the left, the summer map. The one on the right, the winter map, isn't going to help you. So if you use that at all, I don't know how you're going to get the point on this question. Now, some people don't know the difference between cluster and dispersal, or they just never have used those terms before. It's not like they're used every single day. Cluster means accumulation, where people are close together. Dispersal means spread out. So where in Antarctica during the summer is there a cluster of population? The main place I would say would be in McMurdo or King George Island. Those would be where the clusters of populations are located. What about the dispersals? Where is population spread out? Central Antarctica. I would say southwestern Antarctica, southern Antarctica, eastern Antarctica. These kinds of questions want you to use those cardinal points. They want you to use those absolute directions when talking about clusters and dispersals. Unless you can give a more specific place, like, King George Island, for example. So in these dispersed areas, that's where population is spread out. Where the clusters, that's where population is accumulated. Part E, define the concept of environmental possibilism. So when we talked about sustainability, we talked about two theories related to human environmental interactions. We talked about determinism and possibilism. So this one's asking you to define possibilism. So possibilism states that the environment sets certain constraints, but humans, through their culture, through their actions, they can modify their surroundings, or you could have said or overcome these limitations. And you could have said, in addition, this is due to technological advancements and social constraints. We have gotten way better at modifying our environments and overcoming our environmental limitations when we have greater technology and social constraints, as well as better economies. Explain how environmental possibilism explains population size in Antarctica. So we're applying this definition here, like, yes, the environment sets some limitations, but humans can overcome these limitations. How does that apply to Antarctica? Well, when I think of Antarctica, I think of ice. It's very, very cold in Antarctica. If you don't know that, well, now you do. And that can make living in Antarctica very, very difficult. That's why we look at a map again. There's like 4,000 people living there during the summer. That's not that many people. Even during winter, when the winters they're harsh, it's only 1,100 people. So how does that apply to possibilism? So the harsh climate in Antarctica makes it difficult for humans to settle and live, and that explains the small population size, and we could say the small overall population density. But that's a limitation. But how does that relate to possibilism? But technological advancements allow human settlements to develop. And you could have said, just in addition, mostly in major scientific research centers. But the first part of that, the first clause, would have been fine. You could have also said something like, economic growth has allowed individuals or organizations to afford to successfully live in Antarctica. And you could probably say all three of these things if you really wanted to. But the first part is necessary because you got to explain that limitation, because that's part of the definition of possibilism. And then either of these two or something along those lines would have been fine and adequate to earn the point for F. So finally, part G, explain one reason for why King George Island has population present in both summer and winter. We look there, the clusters are still predominant in King George Island. It's not as great as it was in the summer during the winter, but it's still there. We don't see central Antarctica having an accumulation of population during the winter. No, not at all. Winter's probably brutal there. So why are they living in King George Island? Why are they not living in other parts of Antarctica? Why? Because there could be presence of multiple research centers. There's already established infrastructure. And as well, the climate just not being as harsh. It's milder, if you want to use that term. So some of these, yeah, they sound like common sense, but sometimes the answer is going to be just common sense. A lot of stuff you learn in this class, you already know, but you just don't know the actual like vocabulary for it, or you haven't really thought about it that much. So yeah, pretty interesting. You could also just say that this island, I mean, it's on the little tip. It's a lot more accessible to travel to and from. You're going to have to use more resources, more time, more energy, more money to get to that central point of Antarctica rather than King George Island. You just arrive and you're there. Yay. So, yeah. So, what are some takeaways to take away from this FRQ this week? So, the total points on the FRQ is 7. There's no half points. You don't get any partial credits. You got to get 1 point or no points for each part. And the FRQ graders want to give you points. When you take your AP exam, they grade it in June. They want to give you points, and they're going to have a rubric with a bunch of different responses that you could say. And if you don't have something on the rubric, you don't get the point. And they're going to try really hard to find a way for you to get that point. On the AP exam, there's not going to be an FRQ with a Unit 1 focus like this one is. They're going to sprinkle in those Unit 1 skills throughout maybe 1 or 2 parts, or just as well just reading the graphs or reading the maps, because that's a predominant focus of Unit 1. The FRQs in your AP exam are important, though. You don't want to blow them off. If you want to pass the exam, you're going to have to get some points on your FRQs. If you want to get a 3, it may not be as much as it would be to get a 5, but it is 50% of your score, so they are important. So define task verbs. If you see define on your AP exam, they're going to show up maybe once or twice. You don't need anything more than a simple definition. You don't need examples. You don't need to give an explanation. You don't have to give the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Most of the time, you could limit defines to 1 sentence. Population density is different from population distribution. So population density is the number of people per unit of area. For example, you could say 12 people per square mile or 12 people per square kilometer, and it shows how crowded a place is. Population distribution, on the other hand, shows how people are spread out, and it's focused more on spatial analysis. And we can use terms like cluster and dispersal. Scale and scale of analysis are not the same, nor are they interchangeable. So scale, which we used in this question, is essentially what are you looking at? What is the data limited to? And it was limited to a continent, the continent of Antarctica. So it was a continental scale. Something that's high scale shows more detail, but you have less geographic area. That's the trade-off there. Small scale shows less data, but you have more geographic area. So the smallest scale of map of Earth you could get is a map of Earth, a map of the globe. Cluster means accumulation, while dispersal means spread out. Thematic maps show quantitative data and are better for spatial analysis than reference maps, which focus more on qualitative data, like political boundaries and geographic features. Environmental possibilism believes that the environment does set limitations, and determinism believes that those limitations influence our way of life and our human environment interactions and our cultures and politics. But possibilism believes that we can overcome these limitations. Human culture and settlements are able to adapt to those environments. And that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really does help me out. Let me know if you have any questions. You can leave a comment or you can message me on Discord. I'll see you guys in another video. Adios.